Epilogue. Margaret and Brady never once discussed her voyage on the Titanic in public, and also rarely mentioned the disaster in private. Throughout her life, she felt that the memories of those tragically lost were best served by a respectful silence. She also never completely forgave herself for surviving the tragedy. She did permit William to read her diary, and then send it on to Sister Catherine, who later returned it for safekeeping. Margaret completed her high school education in Boston, and then accepted a scholarship to Wesley College. Margaret and Sister Catherine never lost touch, and on 2 occasions, Sister Catherine was actually persuaded to come visit Margaret in the States. The only time Margaret ever returned to England was for her beloved mentor's funeral in 1962. Margaret also kept up regular correspondence with Nora, who later emigrated to the United States with her new husband when she was 19. They had a joyous reunion, and Nora ended up settling in nearby Pawtucket, Rhode Island. After their parting in New York, Margaret and Mrs. Carstairs exchanged letters a couple of times, but never saw each other again. When the First World War broke out in 1914, William immediately volunteered to fight for his new country. He served valiantly until he was seriously wounded during a trench battle. Margaret dropped out of college in order to devote her time to nursing him back to health and working to support them. Although William ultimately recovered and got a job with the Boston Police Department, Margaret never returned to college. She did, however, continue reading voraciously. In 1923, Margaret yet met a young history teacher named Stanley Ryan at a bookstore in Cambridge. They were married the following June and spent the next 44 years laughing and arguing together. They had 3 children, Dorothy, Harriet, and Robert. Margaret devoted many long hours to volunteer work, helping disadvantaged youngsters in the Boston area, and she later ended up heading a halfway house for unwed mothers until her retirement in 1965. During her life, Margaret occasionally boarded planes and regularly took trains, but she refused to set foot on another boat ever again. Despite her many decades in America, she never lost her British accent, but to her surprise, she became extremely fond of coffee. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1994 at the age of 95. Life in America in 1912. Historical note. Over the years, the tragedy of the Titanic has been a source of endless fascination and speculation for people all over the world. The Titanic was the largest ship that had ever been built, and such a technological marvel that even a conservative shipbuilders magazine raved that she was practically unsinkable. In the years before the First World War, public confidence in England and America was at an all-time high. King Edward VII held the British throne during this period, and the era was dubbed the Edwardian Age. A general air of complacent confidence prevailed. The Titanic, with her glittering passenger list, seemed like the ultimate example of human achievement in this optimistic time. In 1912, the rich and famous were famous primarily because they were rich. Society events were reported in great detail in newspapers and magazines. Ordinary citizens enjoyed living vicariously through these reports. There were also a very strong class system in effect. Upper, middle, and lower class people rarely came into contact with one another, and would never have interacted socially. Lower or working class people knew their place, and thought nothing of being ignored by those they considered to be their betters. By that same token, members of the upper class looked down upon anyone who was not at their level financially and socially. The upper class was also expected to set a good example for others, and this concept of noblesse oblige was generally accepted by everyone. Actually, the vast majority of people probably existed somewhere in the middle, but the 2 extremes got the most attention. These rigid notions of class were much stronger in England than they were in America, but they still existed here. Throughout the early 1900s, technology and industry were booming. The international shipping business was a particularly competitive field. Speed and comfort were the 2 most important concerns for any passenger liner. Voyages that had once taken months could now, because of powerful steam engines, be completed in less than a week. As a result, a number of companies were vying to dominate the business. The two best known were the Cunard Line and the White Star Line, which was run by International Mercantile Marine, IMM. In 1907, Cunard was probably the most successful, with their impressive new ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. J. Bruce Ismay and William James Purry, two top IMM executives, decided to meet that challenge by building the three biggest ships in the entire world. They would be called the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Gigantic. The Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, was commissioned to do the job. The Olympic was launched to great fanfare in 1911, and the Titanic was to sail on her maiden voyage a year later. The plan was for the new White Star ships to offer weekly passages from Southampton, England, to New York City. They would be fast, they would be dependable, and they would offer remarkably pleasant sailing experiences. The Titanic was just over 882 feet long and 92.5 feet wide. This length translates to 1/6 of a mile. She stood well over 100 feet tall, which is the equivalent of 11 stories in a building. She had 9 decks, 3 propellers, and weighed more than 45,000 tons. The decks ranged from the boat deck all the way down to the boiler rooms in the bows of the ship. She was equipped with a total of 20 lifeboats, which exceeded the admittedly minimal standards of the day. Most impressively, the ship had been designed to have 16 watertight compartments in its hull, all of which could be closed individually with the mere flip of a switch. This made the ship unusually safe. She had a number of features never before seen on an ocean liner, including a swimming pool, Turkish baths, a squash court, a gymnasium, and several restaurants. The ship even had elevators. Second-class accommodations were equivalent to first class on other ships, and the conditions in third class, also known as steerage, were unusually pleasant. As a Royal Mail steamer, RMS, the Titanic obviously carried countless sacks of letters and postcards. Some of her other cargo and provisions included 40 tons of potatoes, 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, 600 gallons of condensed milk, 15,000 bottles of beer, 5 grand pianos, a marmalade machine, and 12 cases of ostrich feathers. The Titanic also had a crew of approximately 900, though many of these numbers have never been accurately established. The crew was broken down into 3 categories: the deck crew, the engineering crew, and the victualling crew. These various workers included the purser, the Marconi wireless radio operators, the saloon and bedroom stewards, postal clerks, cooks, bakers, firemen, engineers, stewardesses, and, of course, the 8 members of the band. The passenger list included many famous celebrities, including one of the richest men in the world, John Jacob Astor, and his second wife. Other well-known passengers were J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, Thomas Andrews of Harland and Wolff, who had designed the ship, Mrs. J. J. Brown, known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, Isidore Straus, who had founded the famous Macy's department store in New York, and his wife, and Major Archibald Butt, who was President Taft's top military aide. Of the estimated 1,320 passengers, many, of course, were not famous at all. While the first class was heavily comprised of socialites, along with their maids and valets, the second and third class passengers were more conventional. Second class passengers were predominantly successful professionals, including teachers, middle class families, and businessmen. The third class passengers tended to be immigrants on their way to America to make new lives for themselves. Many of them were Irish or Italian, but other nationalities were represented too. At noon on April 10, 1912, the Titanic prepared to cast off under the command of Captain Edward J. Smith. Captain Smith was the most popular of all White Star Line officers and was commonly known as E.J. After completing the maiden voyage of the Titanic, Captain Smith was planning to retire. A near accident marred the beginning of Titanic's journey. While being towed away from her Southampton berth by tugboats, the Titanic nearly collided with a smaller ship, the New York. A quick turn by Captain Smith, along with some swift interference by the tugboat Vulcan, prevented a dangerous crash. Despite this mishap, It was a happy leave-taking, and thousands of people had gathered on the quay to see the ship off. That evening the ship arrived in Cherbourg, France, to pick up more passengers. Then the Titanic steamed towards Queenstown, Ireland, scheduled as its final stop before going to New York City. There were now an estimated 2,200 passengers and crew members aboard. On Thursday, April 11th, the Titanic finally headed out to the open sea. The weather was beautiful, if cold, and the early days of the voyage were uneventful. The atmosphere aboard the ship was cheerful and at ease. Passengers spent most of their time eating fantastic meals, relaxing, and exploring the ship. Then disaster struck on the night of April 14th, 1912. The seas were remarkably calm, but before retiring for the night, Captain Smith instructed First Officer Murdoch to watch out for ice and alert him right away if anything happened. At 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet saw a huge iceberg loom up out of nowhere. He instantly alerted the officers in the bridge. With barely 30 seconds to make a decision, Officer Murdoch ordered, "Hard A starboard!" and tried to steer out of the way. But the starboard side of the Titanic scraped violently against the iceberg. Metal tore, rivets popped, and water began rushing through the hull of the ship. It had been a glancing, but ultimately fatal blow. Captain Smith instantly came to the bridge and summoned ship designer Thomas Andrews to go below and inspect the damage with him. Andrews came to the quick and tragic realization that the Titanic would sink within the next hour or two. In the meantime, most of the passengers and crew were unaware of the seriousness of the situation. Many passengers noticed a slight bump or jarring or scraping, and some were even awakened from a sound sleep. But since they assumed the Titanic was unsinkable, almost no one was terribly concerned. Around midnight, Captain Smith gave orders to uncover the lifeboats and load the women and children first. There were over 2,200 people aboard, and at full occupancy the lifeboats could carry only 1,178. Captain Smith and his fellow crew members tried very hard to keep this information from the passengers, to prevent panic. In order to keep up morale, the band, led by Wallace Hartley, began to play. With total disregard for their own safety, they continued to play on the boat deck until the very end. Wireless operators Phillips and Bride were busy sending out CQD and SOS distress signals. Many ships responded, although most of them were too far away to be able to help. The Carpathia, about 58 miles away, immediately began rushing to the rescue, but it would take her several hours to arrive. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the disaster concerns a nearby ship, the Californian. She may have been as close as 4 or 5 miles away, although this exact distance has never been established. Her radio operator had gone to bed, so she never got the distress calls, nor did she respond to the distress rockets the Titanic began shooting into the sky. Throughout the night, the Titanic's passengers and crew members were, with very few exceptions, remarkably brave in the face of danger. Men routinely stepped back and gave up their lives in order to save women and children. In some cases, wives stayed behind with their husbands in a courageous example of the till death do us part marriage promise. There are many wild legends of officers firing guns to keep frantic passengers at bay, and men dressing as women in order to sneak onto boats. But there is really no way of knowing exactly what occurred. White Star managing director Bruce Ismay took a place in one of the last available boats, and was condemned as a coward for the rest of his life. Once the last lifeboats were gone, there were still about 1,500 people aboard the Titanic, almost all of whom were now doomed. The bow was completely underwater, and the ship was sinking rapidly. Captain Smith told his crew that they had performed nobly, and that it was every man for himself. He was never seen again. During all of this, the band kept playing. Their selfless devotion to duty is one of the most inspiring stories to come out of the tragedy. At about 2:15 a.m., the ship snapped in two, and the bow slipped underwater. Slowly, the stern of the ship began to rise up into the air. The front funnel broke off and slammed into the water, crushing a number of people who were trying to swim away. The stern stood up in the air until it was almost exactly perpendicular, and then it, too, disappeared beneath the water surface. It was 2:20 a.m., and the Titanic was gone forever. Even though many of the lifeboats had room for more people, Only one made a point of going back to pick up survivors. That boat found only 4 people left alive, one of whom died later. At about 4:30 a.m., the Carpathia steamed up, after a risky journey through dangerous fields of ice. Her commander, Captain Rostron, demonstrated astonishing seamanship and grace under pressure. The survivors were brought on board, and the Carpathia set sail for New York City. Just over 700 people survived, while more than 1,500 perished. The night the Titanic sank was one of darkness and courage, nobility and despair. For the most part, the very best of humanity was on display, with the very worst of results. It is a night that will never be forgotten. If you've enjoyed this recording, please like and share and subscribe to my channel. Thanks.